welcome all of you. We also know that there are people online around the world. We know that because there are some questions which are beginning to come in online even before the talk. So there will be more that will come that way. Well, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Michael Porter, who is Bishop William Lawrence University professor at Harvard Business School. He is a world-famous management guru, but what he does not do, and for this I have to use a Hindi word because there's no other word, is guru-giri. Guru-giri is being a guru without too much content. That's guru-giri. So he's a guru, but he does not do guru-giri. What he has is a huge body of research rooted in data, rooted in statistics, rooted in economic theory, which gets reflected in advice, very practical advice for the world and what you do. His original training, not surprisingly, given the rootedness of his work, is in aerospace engineering, which is what he did at Preston. I mean, those things done with fluff would not stay up in the air for too long. So there has to be solid content in that. You all know of his work on competitive strategy, the competitive advantage of nations. These are celebrated books which are read all around the world. What is less well known, but is a fact, is his engagement, not just with corporations and business strategy, but with NGOs, but with nonprofit organizations, with the healthcare sector, very wide range of work. Since 2013, Michael Porter has been engaged in working on the Social Progress Index, and that is what he's going to talk about, and that is an area where, as I just said, he has had a lot of engagement. One reason why this is very important to us at the World Bank is of our twin goals, and in particular, the promoting shared prosperity, the way we are taking this agenda forward. The way we have written these goals down formally, they are done in money metrics. But we are aware that there are many other dimensions to this. Right now, there is a commission, as you know, the Tony Atkinson Commission, which is advising us. They will just give some advice as to these are the additional things. I'm raising my volume to counteract this. Additional things that we will, at the World Bank, we will need to look at. I have had some familiarity, not a deep one, with the work that Michael Porter and his colleagues, several of them, have been doing. And I think actually there is going to be a lot of overlap in the kinds of dimensions that we would like to do, but we have not taken the first steps, and the dimensions where they have taken the first steps and are well into it. With that, it's exactly 1 hour, and I hope that we will get a little bit of time for Q&A. Michael Porter, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. Well, Kaushik, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's very good to be here at the bank, where I've spent a little bit of time over the last few years on the change process and some other dimensions of what the bank has been up to. But today I'd like to talk about a body of work that I believe is right in the center of what the World Bank does. And has the potential, I think, to open up how we think about the agenda of the bank and other development organizations and of governments. And that's around this issue of social progress. And if we kind of step back and think a little bit about how we've been proceeding to think about development and measure development, we have a long tradition now of measuring very carefully and with great rigor economic development. And I've been part of this. I was co-chair of the Global Competitiveness Report for many years. I have done a lot of work on this myself, and I think we have a lot of rigor and depth of awareness of how to capture and measure and understand economic development. And that's great. And that progress has, I think, been important. More recently, we've started to understand that when we think about economic development, we have to think about things like inclusiveness and whether that economic development is shared. I think that is reflected in the shared prosperity goal of the World Bank, which I strongly support and have strongly encouraged right from the beginning. And kind of that's what we've been primarily focused on. But there's a whole nother world around, how are people doing, not just their income, but in the multiplicity of ways that human beings are living their experience, their life experience. There's now a growing literature on this dimension of development. And the question is, how do we bring these things together? How do we think more holistically about development to actually include both economic dimensions and social dimensions together? And that was really the motivation for this body of work that started actually about 2010 with some real innovative pioneers and ultimately a substantial team that's been doing this work under my overall direction. It's also, in a way, the motivation for me. You might ask, why would I be involved in a major project on social progress? I'm not a social progress guy. I'm an economic guy. But what I've come to believe very, very strongly is the real key to mastering economic development is to understand this connection, how these things fit together. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward today. Now, I think the traditional kind of received wisdom that we've all been operating on is, well, we can focus mostly on economic development because if we do a good job there, social progress follows. Societies get better, people's circumstances get better. And we've kind of made the assumption that if we do this, that happens. But I think we're also learning that actually sometimes if we do this on the left, social progress doesn't seem to follow. We have the Arab Spring. These are countries that were doing quite well economically, and yet they had a meltdown because something was going deeply wrong in their society. Yeah, I think of Tunisia, a country that many of us were celebrating as a big success story, that completely melted down because we'd really missed looking deeply at the right-hand side here. We assumed that since they were doing well economically, things were going well for that society, but ultimately it turned out that they weren't. So I think we're getting an increasing view that although there is a relationship between economic development and social progress, and we'll talk a lot more about how to measure that, it's not a one-to-one relationship, and it doesn't always happen, particularly in certain dimensions that we'll talk about as well. I think we're also starting to get the idea, and of course all of you understand this because you're practitioners, you're on the ground, you're in touch with what's happening on the ground. We're starting to get the idea that actually if you make progress in areas of social progress, that actually is pretty important to allowing sustained economic development. So if you don't get some of the foundations and enablers right on the social side, you run out of steam on the economic side. Or you run out of legitimacy and the willingness of citizens to play along on the things that you have to do on the economic side. So we're pretty sure now that there's a relationship in this direction, not just in that direction. And one of our fundamental purposes was to understand and sort out what this two-way link actually is. And of course, we couldn't do that historically because we couldn't measure the right-hand side. We didn't have any data. The data on the social side has been balkanized. It's been siloed. Every person has their issue. It's women, it's nutrition, it's environment, it's this, it's that. But we never had any comprehensive way of actually understanding how well countries were doing or other regions were doing on the social side. And so our view was that it is critical now, at this moment, in development, thinking, and practice to kind of start to stitch these things together. And that's what we've set out to do. Is it easy? No. Is what we've done perfect? No. But I hope I'll persuade you that we've come a long way to start to be able to create a measurement framework. And that measurement framework is already giving us great insight on the connection between these two sides. So let's talk about that. Now, the challenge we had was how do we actually measure social progress? What is social progress? How would we define that? And there, I think we have drawn on what is now a vast literature. There's lots of terrific work on many, many dimensions of people's lives and the societies in which they live. There's been enormous progress in that area academically. There's a huge literature. But the question is, how do we take that huge, disparate and largely siloed literature and kind of aggregate it in some hopefully coherent framework that we can get consensus on? And that's what we've been up to. That was really the first order challenge here. Now, this whole effort kind of, in a sense, has its roots in the long-standing discussion about the need to move beyond GDP. I learned actually not that long ago that the first person to echo the need to move beyond GDP to measure success in societies was actually Simon Kuznets. The day he introduced GDP, he raised this issue. Don't take this as the measure of success. This is important, this tells us something, but it doesn't tell us actually fully if we're really successful. But you all probably think mostly of my colleague Amartya Sen, who has really brought this idea to the surface, and really made the observation that we really have to look at human capabilities reflected in the lived experience of people if we're going to really understand, social progress. And we, in a very profound way, are building on his work in this literature. And of course, we're also building on the Human Development Index. That was an effort that Professor Sen had a lot to do with personally to try to take the first steps towards moving beyond GDP and to measure success. But as you all know, the Human Development Index is relatively spare. It's got GDP in it, but it's got sort of health measures and education measures in it. And we can see why those measures was picked, but that clearly doesn't capture the whole set of things that we all agree now are important to the lived experience of a human being somewhere in the world. So we had to go beyond the HDI. Another very important point that I'll stress many times is that one of the problems with the HDI is it put economic measures and social measures in the same framework. And we think that was understandable, but not the right approach. That we need to pull these things apart. Because unless we pull them apart, we're not going to understand how to think about the relationships among them. And we're also, when we put them together, we're not quite sure what we're capturing in terms of the progress that we measure. So as you'll see, we have a very strong principle here that we're focusing on measuring social progress itself and not conflating that with economic measures. And we'll talk further about that as we go forward. Our approach of separating the social and the economic, I think, fortunately, has been strongly supported by Mark Fleurbe and Blanchette's book, which really came to the conclusion after 400 pages of really rich study that we really had to separate these things. So we're fortunate that we were aligned with them as we introduced our first version of our index the same year the book came out. Luckily, we were aligned. So in terms of the group that's done this, we have a steering committee of directors that have been advising this process and some academic advisors. We've had enormous interchange with scholars in this field. Not before we introduced this, but also as we published now 2.5 social progress indexes, we've gotten lots of feedback from around the world. And we love that, and I think it's allowed us to tighten and improve this framework. We've also become very involved now. I'm a member of the Honorary Advisory Committee of the IPSP. We're very involved with that organization, which we welcome and think is a tremendous step forward to kind of pull together academic thinking in this area. Also the high-level expert group at the OECD. So this is an area where I think the time has come for us to really raise dramatically the bar in the measurement of how societies are progressing and allow us to take that next step in enriching our thinking about economic development as what we've traditionally concentrated on. So how did we construct the Social Progress Index? Well, we had a number of critical principles. First, we believed in the sort of Sen view of capabilities and the lived human experience. So what we're trying to capture here is that. We're trying to capture the multiple dimensions of lived human experience that actually matter to citizens as identified in the literature. And we're not using distribution of income or various other economic measures as a proxy. We are actually trying to capture lived experience directly. We're also not using subjective things like happiness. I'll show you a slide later on how this all relates to happiness, but we wanted to actually measure the lived experience directly, focusing exclusively on social indicators and then the ability to connect those later to economic. A focus on outcomes, not inputs, not how much the government was spending on education, but the educational outcomes that, as best we could measure them. A framework that was broad enough and all-encompassing enough and holistic enough to be relevant for all countries. A lot of the work here has been really focused on very low-income countries, didn't have much lesson and learning for higher-income countries. We've tried to create a more holistic approach that is quite powerful for any country at any stage in its particular journey. And finally, we wanted to be granular enough to make it actionable, so that you could actually, if you had the data, you could then do something about it because you knew exactly what you were talking about and therefore exactly what you might need to influence. So out of our deep study of the literature over multiple years, we came to the following definition of social progress. There has been no definition of social progress. I'm sure we can debate this for many, many years to come, but we think this definition really captures the spirit of the literature as well as something that makes sense to us. You can read it. You know, the capacity of a society to meet the basic human needs of its citizens, establish the building blocks that allow both citizens and communities to improve the quality of life, and create the conditions so that any and all individuals can reach his or her full potential in life. That's the way we tried to capture this very broad phenomenon called social progress. And to activate that into a measurement framework, we created a framework that looks like this. It has three basic dimensions that draw from the definition earlier. Basic human needs. I think that's pretty intuitive. The foundations of well-being, and you can see the major components of that. Access to knowledge, communication, health and wellness, and a sustainable environment where people can be healthy and enjoy the environment in which they work. And then the third dimension is opportunity. Can any person achieve his or her full potential without barriers, without obstacles, without impediments? Now, I think of these three, you'll recognize almost all these topics. The one that I think we've found that has been least examined is opportunity. It's really not been part of the discourse in much of the literature on social development and social progress, but we find it's, first of all, critical and also turns out to be quite interesting in terms of what role it seems to play in all of this. There are some gray areas. We've had extended debates. For example, employment is an economic kind of indicator, but many would argue that employment is not just about earning an income, it's about satisfaction and dignity that come from having a job. That's kind of a gray area. But we've opted on the gray areas to stay on the social side, to stay on the things that are really, kind of directly, lived human experience type variables. And that's what we ultimately did. We are continuing to refine this framework. We'd be happy to have questions on any of this, and not just today, but going forward. This is a long-term effort that we hope to sustain for a long period of time. Now, to build out that framework, then, we have to figure out what to measure in each of those areas. And for that purpose, we identified indicators that we can measure in each of those broad components. The framework starts with dimensions. There are the three big dimensions. There's components of each dimension, and then there's indicators of each component. That's the kind of analytical structure. To select the indicators, of course, we had literature, but we also had the reality of needing data. So we went on an Easter egg hunt for data all over the world that was widely available on all of these kind of areas, okay? And so what we're measuring here in this framework today is partly a reflection of what data is robust. And we needed data sets that applied across quite a few countries, almost all, in most cases, that we were covering. We are now at 133 different countries that we are measuring this way. We also wanted data which had integrity, that the way it was measured and who was measuring it and how they were measuring it was rigorous and robust, and we had confidence in it. We are facing a constraint still in data. There are some of these concepts that are not able to be captured in data as well as we would like. We are working hard with the data provider groups, including the World Bank, to see if we can improve that. So I think we never want to claim that this data is perfect, but ultimately it's the best data in the world that we can find. The analysis starts at a national level. The reason we started at the national level is mostly because that's where most of the data is. There's lots of data on countries across large samples of countries. But the concept can be disaggregated to the state level, to cities, to even neighborhoods. Conceptually, it's the same, because you're actually trying to measure the lived experience of human beings wherever they live. So as you'll see later, the initial work has been heavily about measuring countries and comparing them, but we're already starting to roll out a substantial number of subnational indices and city-level industries in various parts of the world. I'll show you that a little bit later. To get each component, we took the indicators that we selected and thought were the best and roll those up using principal component analysis. That's because indicators often overlap. They sort of kind of overlap in terms of what they're measuring, and we wanted to avoid the double counting and the duplication as we rolled up the individual indicators. But from the component level, we just basically took the average from there. We have not weighted whether opportunity is more important than basic human needs. We've just simply aggregated in a linear way. Another critical issue here that I want to bring your attention to is the issue of the scores for indicators and components. What we did was, once we collected the data, we actually converted all of the indicators to a 0 to 100 scoring. And sometimes 0, meaning the worst you could possibly do, and 100 is the best you possibly do, is quite clear. We could achieve potentially 100% people having basic nutrition. But in other areas, like, for example, life expectancy, there's no theoretical maximum quite yet. We don't quite know what it is. So there we took what's the best that anybody's ever achieved in any place in the last 10 years. So think of 0 being really lousy performance from a global kind of perspective, and think of 100 as being, this is the best we can imagine. And all of the scoring here is somewhere in between. So when you have a 60 score, that means you're 60% of the way towards nirvana on this particular factor. If you have a 90 score, boy, you're getting really close to the best you can possibly imagine. Okay, so think of these component scores that way, which we think actually bring an intuitive advantage to this effort in kind of interpreting what the data is actually telling us. So let's start with what we found. This is the global level. How's the world doing on social progress? And here we summed all the country results weighted by population. So this is kind of the population-weighted sum of every country. And here the average for the world is 61. 61, just so you know, is the score of Cuba and Kazakhstan. That's where the world is on average right now, weighted by population on these various components and dimensions. You see that, you know, the world's doing pretty well in nutrition and basic medical care. We've come a long way in that area in terms of the average performance in the world. Access to basic knowledge, we've come a long, long way. But if you look at things like tolerance and inclusion, or personal rights, or even personal safety, we're far from close to anything near perfection, okay? I think we would highlight and applaud the Millennium Development Goals for putting a lot of attention on things like these. But we'd also say that some of those things, you know, the playbook and how we do that is a little more transparent and a little less subject to a lot of complicated, you know, political and social, you know, congruence efforts. So you can see the differences from the world's point of view, and I think it tells us that actually some of the things where we have to really work hard because we just are not getting there, like some of those lower bars here in this chart. Now, in terms of countries, this is obviously, there's a lot of countries, 133 countries that we actually were able to measure in the 2015 version of this. Those 133 countries cover 95% of all the world's population. So we're pretty far down the road, but we're missing, you know, material countries for a whole variety of reasons, mostly data. What we find is that this is kind of the ranking of those countries. And at one level, this is pretty much what we would expect. You know, these are relatively high-income countries. Scandinavia is very well represented. If we go down to the very low end, you know, we'll see very low-income countries. Many of them have, you know, challenged states and, you know, all kinds of instability that you guys work on every day. And it kind of stretches out in between. Each country is a story. It's a different story, and I'll show you a little bit how to think about those stories in a moment. So at a broad level, I think, you know, the good news is that this sort of seems intuitive, okay? It also shows this. For the first time ever in all of history, we at least have a way of getting at what's the connection between GDP per capita and social progress. Okay, and that's this chart. We've never been able to even ask this question before in a rigorous way. Okay, so what does this look like? What is this picture telling us? Again, I spent a lot of my life working on how do you boost GDP per capita. So what is this chart telling me about how valid all that work was? Okay? It says, first of all, it was valid. There is a positive and substantial relationship between GDP per capita and social progress. So yes, economic development does matter for human beings' lived experience. And I think that's intuitive. If you have more resources in the society, you can deal with more things and provide more things to those human beings that are living in a particular area. Second thing you see here is you see a nonlinear relationship. As income grows a little bit here, look at what happens. We see a tremendous improvement in social progress as you go from 0 to 5,000 or 0 even to 10,000. But then what happens is we start to see this relationship tail off. The improvement of social progress for the improvement in income goes down, okay? It gets harder. It gets harder. And we'll see a little bit later why it gets harder. What we find is that what happens when you get up in here is you start to face headwinds in moving social progress even further. And those headwinds tend to be primarily contained in two areas, and no surprise to any of you: health and the environment. As you get up to high levels of income, you start to have new problems or harder problems in the areas of health and the environment than you would experience earlier on, on the bottom of this chart. I think the third thing that this tells us is, however, that economic development doesn't explain everything. In fact, we have a lot of outliers. There's some countries that are overperformers. For a given level of GDP per capita, they're doing much better than you would expect from this data set on social progress. Countries like New Zealand, Canada, Costa Rica, Norway. You see, we in the U.S., we're kind of on the line. Nothing remarkable about the U.S. We see other countries like Russia, China, India, Kuwait. This is UAE. This is Saudi. Well below what you would expect, given their level of income, in terms of the lived experience of the society. So, and an interesting exercise is to go up at any given level of income or across at any given level of social progress and just see how much variation there is. Look at 80, you've got Costa Rica's almost 80, and so is France. And yet France's income is hugely higher than Costa Rica's. And going up at 20,000, you can see we've got countries down here, but we've got also countries down there, which is a huge difference in the actual lived experience of the citizens. So this is starting to tell us that we have to look at both of these things. We can't conflate them. We can't assume anything about one causing the other. We have to look at this, because these are sort of independent, to a significant extent, things about success and development. So when we measure development, we can't just measure economics. We have to measure this other stuff too, because it's not predictable that we're going to have this stuff come follow the economics, okay? And that was a hunch we had, but again, we've never had this data before, so we had a hunch. Now we have some facts. Are the facts perfect? No. Will they get better? Yes. Will many of the people in this room be able to work on this and help us make it better? You darn right. Would we love to work with the World Bank to really nail this even more than we have already? You bet. That's why we're here. So what do we know about the relationship with social progress and economic development? We know that GDP per capita is an incomplete measure of a country's overall performance. Simon Kuznets knew that. Amartya Sen knew that. A lot of smart people knew that. But now we've actually been able to kind of document and provide the data framework to actually examine it. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. What we find is that if we take the three dimensions and split them up, basic human needs, foundation of wellness, and opportunity, we find that the relationship with basic human needs and income is the strongest. As income goes up, basic human needs go up the fastest, okay? Now, there's still a lot of noise. This is a career's work for everybody in this room to help countries figure out how to do this well. You don't automatically improve basic human needs when your income goes up, but you have the opportunity to really improve things as income goes up a modest amount, okay? But how to do this is still complicated. There's still a lot of variation. Again, the experiment always to do is look at any given level of social progress and then look at the income of people that are at that level. Look at any given level of income and see the degree of difference in social progress that you see at that level, in this case in basic human needs. Foundations for well-being are somewhere in between, and you see that there's a rapid tailing off effect. That's because an important reason is that the environment is part of this. This is where we actually capture the environment. And the environmental headwind it really holds back absolute progress in this area. And then we find that the opportunity is, again, is even behind that. So as income goes up, how high opportunity goes up is much lower than how fast basic human needs improve, okay? And again, I think these are all intuitive. You also see the tremendous noise in opportunity. in the world. The tremendous variation at any given level of income or at any given level of opportunity. And this proves to be quite an interesting variable or set of variables that we'll look at a little bit further. Now, let's talk about, we've talked about the link between social progress and GDP per capita. We could dig into that a lot more deeply. We have lots and lots of more nuance on individual areas, within opportunity, which areas are moving more in sync, which areas are out of sync, and so forth. But now let's look at some of the other thinking out there about success, and particularly about economic success. And this is the analysis of Gini, income inequality. The relationship between income inequality and social progress. Some would tell us that these are sort of joined at the hip. That income inequality is a powerful indicator that social progress, is not where we want it to be. What we find is that the data actually doesn't support that. There is a relationship. This covers 117 of our countries for which we have Ginis. There is a relationship, but it's really noisy. Again, do the experiment. At a given level of social progress, 60 say, we've got countries over here at a Gini of 60, but at the same level of social progress, we've got countries over here at a Gini of 25. So income inequality is a very blunt instrument. It's a very complicated thing, this inequality, because there's really two things going on. How high can the people at the top do in terms of income? But it also, what's the progress of the people on the bottom? And those can be decoupled in a very important way. So this analysis would really caution that we use income inequality as a decisive, critical factor. It's complicated, it's nuanced, it's not directly connected very well to social progress. We have, you look at the variation. Okay. Now, in contrast, this is poverty. Poverty is quite connected to social progress. There's quite a stronger relationship. For us, that's kind of intuitively makes much more sense to us. Because poverty has a lot to do with the capabilities of citizens. And the Social Progress Index is really capturing the capabilities of all citizens. And so we see a relatively strong connection here. And we think if we really want to eliminate poverty, then some of the things we need to do are economic policies. But a lot of the things we need to do are very much in this rich array of social progress indicators, okay? And I think that tells me, anyway, that the World Bank's addition of a shared prosperity goal is in the right direction. We're really not looking at the income inequality, but we're looking at the sort of B40, which is how well are the people on the bottom doing. We think that's the right concept, not Gini. And I'll show you some data on that later. And we'll find that B40 is related in a good way to social progress, but again, it's not perfect. So as Kaushik said earlier, we may want to go beyond B40 to actually measure shared prosperity in a society, okay? And we'll talk about that in a moment. We also looked at life satisfaction. It's a subjective indicator. We've learned a lot from the work on life satisfaction. We like the work and applaud the work on life satisfaction. We find quite a good, solid relationship between social progress and life satisfaction, as we would expect. But what's interesting that we found so far, and we have much more work to do here, is actually if you control for GDP in looking at the relationship between social progress and life satisfaction, what you find is that the thing that sticks out that's independent and not captured by GDP is opportunity. Opportunity is a powerful force in life satisfaction. Much more so controlling for GDP, which captures basic human needs quite well and foundations for well-being, but controlling for GDP, opportunity really sticks out. And it just shows us how critical it is for us to really understand and find some ways of dealing with issues of opportunity at the national level, which are really, really hard because they have so much to do with ideology and all kinds of things that you all deal with every day. But this work really highlights the opportunity dimension as being quite decisive. So I've given you some of the results on how things relate to things that we have found important and understand over the years. In terms of looking at particular countries, our goal with Social Progress Index is really to create a benchmarking strategy tool for social progress so that a country can kind of look holistically at, okay, how are we doing here? And then how do we break that apart into the specific areas that are actionable? And so what we do here is that to create a benchmarking tool, we look at a given country's closest economic peers, the 15 countries closest to that country in GDP per capita. And for that set of peers, we look at, is this country that we're looking at statistically better or statistically worse than the average performance of those 15 closest economic peers? That's the way we're doing benchmarking at this point, which we found, pretty persuasive, but I'm sure, again, we will do better. What we can do then is we can look at all the dimensions of, and all the indicators of social progress. And the reason this is important is because what we found is the social development community and literature and organizations are extremely siloed. And nobody really pulls all this together. So you end up with individual indicators of individual things, but you can't kind of figure out where's my strength, where's my weaknesses, where should I put my priority, where am I doing okay for now? Okay? And what we set out to do is try to create a framework that would allow countries to do that kind of strategic assessment. Just like we have the tools to analyze, what's driving your competitiveness and where are you strong and weak. I did that for many years with the Global Competitiveness Report. Okay? We've never been able to do that on the social side because we, again, haven't had the data. So here would be a country's scorecard. And Costa Rica, as you may remember from the earlier chart, is an overperformer. It does better on social progress than you would expect given its GDP per capita. Well better. Okay? And what this shows you is kind of where its real strengths are, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of green for Costa Rica. There's green in human needs, there's green in foundations for well-being, and there's green at the opportunity level. So in all three major dimensions, they're green. They do better than their economic peers, and you can see some of the areas of particular strength. Life expectancy, premature deaths, tolerance, absence of corruption, rights and freedoms, and crime. And this sort of says, okay, Costa Rica, if you want to move forward and create a better society, what do you need to work on? You need to work on obesity. You need to work on suicides. You need to work on water withdrawals. You need to work on homicide. You need to work on freedom of movement, which is a little bit sticky. You need to work on, freedom of religion, early marriage. This is your agenda. If what you really want to do is create a better society, and comparing yourself to the countries that are sort of in the same zone as you are, if you had double the income, maybe you should have even higher aspirations. Now, what we find is Costa Rica is superbly successful on this stuff, but Costa Rica's economic development has been sputtering. So here's a case where social progress is now well ahead of economic development, and now really Costa Rica's critical priority is not only to fix this stuff, but really to kind of re-energize its economic strategy. And the reasons that they have not done well economically, some of you may know about, but there's a long set of explanations for that. But they need to get better, because ultimately the economic is going to be a constraint. And economic does matter in and of itself. Okay, so we have to solve that. Now let's take another kind of interesting example. This is Rwanda. This is a country where I have worked extensively now for 8 or 9 years. There was just something about a country that had been devastated by genocide that was just irresistible. How could we deal with this? How could we get this country moving? How could we create economic growth? How could we create a better society? And so I've been sort of helping out on the side there. And what you find is it's very interesting. This is a very poor country still, but it's a country that is overperforming on social progress. And compared to its, economic peers. And that's because you all know the story. They've made massive investments in many of these areas. Health areas, educational areas, tolerance of women, all kinds of areas they put a lot of resources in, even though they were really poor. And I think key to the Rwanda strategy has been, look, if we build these capabilities and move the needle on some of the things that really screwed up our society, we will create a foundation for economic growth. And their growth numbers are looking pretty darn good, and we're rooting for them. Now let's take another country. Here's Indonesia. I haven't read the World Bank report on Indonesia and the rankings of Indonesia, but most people say Indonesia is a great economic success story. It's been growing at 5% or more for the last number of years. Lots and lots of progress. We have a case study we teach in my course at Harvard on Indonesia. It's a country that was a mess, but their economic act is coming together. But what we see here is their social progress act is in shambles. They haven't actually taken the economic progress they've made and taken advantage of that to really make their country a better society for the citizens. Okay? So I think these examples show you that now that we have these data, we can start to be more strategic about development. Not just the economic development that we already understand fairly well, but about the holistic notion of development, which I think we now have to adopt. We can no longer take economic development as a proxy and say that's our job, that's our development challenge. We have to start to see these things together. Again, you all know this, but a lot of people still take the shortcut, and I think the world and countries suffer as a result. Now, we also, just in conclusion, I want to talk about the shared prosperity goal of the World Bank. And we've set out to actually measure the relationship between social progress and B40. We found that there is a good relationship. So the good news is that B40 is capturing, in some ways, a good chunk of the improvement in social progress. That's a good thing. But we also found, and you will not be surprised, that there's a lot of variation. So if we look at social progress of 60, we see B40 of 2, or this is per day, and we see 10 at the same level of social progress. So clearly there's something going on here that's more than the income of the lower income people. And I'm hopeful that as you deepen and develop your framework for thinking about whether you're succeeding at the shared prosperity goal, we will start to add these dimensions that we've been talking about today. Now, I know we have limited time, but I just wanted to say that this is not a theoretical exercise only. Our aim is actually to affect practice at the country level. We've started to have tremendous diffusion of this concept. We have countries and regions and states and cities that are now measuring this, comparing it, and using it to make choices. And there's lots of examples that we can provide, and these are just some of the places where we're heavily involved. Some of the founders of this effort, before I even started, were Latin Americans, so we have an unusual amount of influence now in Latin America, but that's now spreading around the world. We're very excited that the EU is going to use this framework to compare social progress in their 272 regions. And this will be rolling out next year, and we're very excited that finally there's a way in this entire gigantic European space to start to get at these issues in a rigorous and data-driven way. So what does this mean for the bank? We think that social progress index and this framework is a powerful complement to what traditionally the bank has done. It's not that the bank doesn't think about these societal issues and social issues, particularly ones that are most connected to economic, like education and health, but ultimately we think we can fill that and broaden that body of work, and we are anxious to work with you on that. We think that this framework can help you supplement the existing income-based measure of shared prosperity, B40, and we're sure that we can work together also to improve the analytics and also the data. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope now we have got a broader view now of what development actually is and how we can think about it and harness progress better, and it'll be a privilege to take some questions. Thank you.
We are very close to our time limit, but let's exceed that by 5 minutes. So we'll take on 3 questions. There are several which have come in online. But as you walk up, okay, you ask, then I'm going to ask an online one. And yeah, please. Yeah.
So very quickly, 2 quick questions. One, how do you measure a norm that is not just a socially expressed norm, but an internal moral norm? For example, what's 100% of tolerance for homosexuality? Is it just a legal measure or something else? Second, obviously there are some gender-specific norms, maternal mortality. Do you somehow disaggregate the other ones by gender to be able to understand that dynamic? And does it matter in the overall SDI score? Thank you.
Well, yes, let me say on some measures are, there's kind of a clear good and there's a clear, bad. And we just use that for 0 and 100. For something like these moral aspects, we actually look at the actual experience that's been achieved in the world. So tolerance for homosexuality, 100 would be roughly what the best country in the world's performance has been over the last 10 years. And 0 would be what, poorly performing countries have achieved on that variable. Well, the definition of the measure is in there. There's various scales, and various NGOs have created metrics and measurement tools for each of these areas, and so we draw heavily on those. Some of them are better than others, and we're working very hard to try to raise the bar on the measurement. But on your other point, on gender, we have you look carefully at all those little words up there. You'll see that there's quite a few things in various parts of the framework that actually look at men versus women, and so we've tried to make the gender integral to the whole framework.
We will take in these 2 questions, but let me quickly slip in. These are questions, short question, one from Gary Spolander coming online. There are lots of online questions. Is there a way of engaging social workers, people on the ground for this broader project? That's his curiosity. And another person, Lakshman Newpane, is asking whether how yours relates to the Human Development Index, which is much leaner. They look at these 3 things. So if you take on these 2 questions, then we will take on 2 from the floor. But let's give Michael the chance to respond to these.
On the HDI, Human Development Index, I did mention this briefly, but basically the Human Development Index is different in 2 ways. First of all, it's very spare. It really only covers health and education and not all the other things. And it was a good start. It was a particularly good start for very poor countries because first order issue, of how to start moving up. But it also, unfortunately, conflated an economic measure, GDP, with social measures. Therefore, it's not clear what you're getting at the end of the day. If you have a high score, what does that really mean? So we've tried to kind of go beyond that formulation. In terms of, we are now using this tool and framework at a very granular level in communities. And yes, there's a lot of both knowledge and also ability to impact that comes from social sector workers, on the ground. And so our dream is to find a way to actualize activity in this area informed by this kind of a data framework.
Let's take 2 questions now, and then I'll give the floor to my
John Strand from the research department of the bank. I thought this was very fascinating. One issue here that raises is that a lot of these measures are endogenously chosen by government. Say that the government may choose a high degree of equality and thus forsake some growth or level of income, and those things makes these correlations sometimes hard to interpret. So there's a lot of issues. So that the other issue I want to just raise is: have you thought about using these measures of happiness somehow? I saw Justin Wolf was one of your people on the list there, and he's involved in that. And you could think of issue of how happy people or how content people actually are. And is that because that's another sort of measure? You're trying to look at it sort of objectively, but you could also do it subjectively and look at that. And is that something that's on your agenda?
Well,
I was just going to say, I'm going to take one more question at the back. So I'm afraid we are over the time limit. So there may be the chance for a little informal conversation after that. But do you want to take this on before the last one?
Let me just quickly talk about happiness. I guess, you know, we believe that happiness tells us something very important, and there's a careful literature on that, and Justin has been, you know, worked with us and advised us on this effort. What we're really about is, what we find is a high correlation between social progress and happiness. And the thing that we discovered that's kind of interesting about what really drives happiness is that opportunity is really important. Okay? But at the broad level, what we believe is we have to, just telling you that people are happy or not happy is not getting us very far. We have to figure out why. You know, what drives happiness? What conditions create contented citizens that are happy and excited to be part of that particular society? So we find that our measure lines up pretty well with happiness, which we find encouraging. But ultimately, what we're then able to do is sort of start to disaggregate and start to see what might be the driver that a government might want to influence. In terms of the endogeneity, you know, I think we're mostly just measuring the facts on the ground. You know, what's the basic nutrition situation in this country? You know, objectively, based on the best available measures, comparable across countries. The government may have chosen to work on that, and that may be why a country is good, or the government may have chosen to work on something like that, but we are at this point just measuring the results, the outcomes. Now, you know, there's a lot of work to be done on backing up the chain of causality of how did you get to those outcomes, and, you know, what strategies work. And the starting point in our framework is you can find other countries that are roughly at your level that do better on this than you are on any given variable, and look at what they did. So we have here a vehicle to figure out who to look at and who to study and who to emulate or avoid emulating, depending on the circumstances.
Okay, and that's the last one. Karen.
Right, so my question is similar just a little bit to the HDI question. I don't...
You know, we are not hearing that well. Do you want to, either louder or come up here?
I was just saying that my question is probably similar to the HDI question. The UNDP did come up with some other measure called the multi-dimensional poverty index, and you just had showed us on one of the slides that there's a very close correlation between poverty and social progress. So I was just wondering, in your research and in your results, are you seeing that correlation, and how do the two actually, do they even actually complement each other?
Well, there's a lot of indexes. OECD has Better Life, there's multidimensional poverty, there's many, many indexes. All of them, I think, either are focused on a narrower topic than the overall health of a society, or they're focused on a particular set of countries, poorer countries. And third, many of them have economic measures. So you're conflating economic success with social outcomes. So, you know, given the time, perhaps I can't do the analysis of the multidimensional poverty index head to head. But again, this work is not focused just on poverty. It's focused holistically. This work is powerful for a very advanced country. You know, one of the things that this has shown is just how embarrassed we should be in the United States for how poorly we're doing on a lot of these things, you know, and we thought of ourselves as, you know, very progressive and all that. Well, we're not, you know, and so this work is not just for poor countries, it's for all countries, and it sort of embodies the idea that there's a kind of progression and a sequencing of social progress dimensions over time, and certain things that are harder to do and certain things that you can make easier progress on. And what we're trying to do is unlock the code of how do we strategically approach the dual challenge of economic and social development, which I think is what we're all signed up to work on. So, well, thank you for being here, and again, I hope many good things follow between us and you.
Thank you.